What's up, guys? Subby Ellie here, and welcome to episode 2 of my Food for Thought video podcast, Innocent or Guilty. Now, if you guys haven't seen episode 1 of my podcast, I recommend you go do so. There's a link down in this post, and if you want to read any other of my blog posts, then click on the header above, and it'll take you to the homepage of my website. Now, in the first episode, we spoke more of Serial as a podcast in a whole, and just, the podcast format itself, and less about the content of the Serial podcast, which is mainly what this episode is going to be focused on. So it is quite different than the first one, and it also is going to take a lot more analysis compared to the first episode. So this is why this one's quite longer than the first. And also to help us understand entirely and break down that length, I've broken down this podcast into 4 parts. So the first part is personal connection. The second part is gathered evidence. The third part is hole in the story. And fourth part is not in this alone. Now, kind of ambiguous titles, I understand, but as we go along, they will make more sense. And hopefully, as time goes on, you'll understand more where my position is on this podcast, on Adnan Syed's case, and why it is the way it is. So, to begin, part 1, personal connection. So, personal connection. What was very interesting to me about Serial, and this was something that happened very early on in the first episode, actually, when she's describing Adnan Syed, is my personal connection with Adnan Syed as a character. Of course, without the whole murdering in prison stuff, but a lot of what she described him as, and a lot of what his sister described him as, has a lot to do with me personally. So for those, if you guys forgot, this is what the sister had to say about Adnan.
He was like the community's golden child.
Oh, really? Talk more about that.
He was an honor roll student, volunteer EMT. He was like on the football team. He was a star runner on the track team. He was the homecoming king. He led prayers at the mosque. So he was, everybody knew Adnan to be, somebody who's going to do something really big.
So at the expense of sounding kind of cocky, a lot of what Rabia describes about Adnan happens to be true about me and my... At least like my recent past, as well as I played football, baseball, and basketball for the school teams. I went to the mosque. I volunteered 2 full summers to the mosque, and took some head counseling positions there as well. And obviously I wouldn't know this unless I went around and asked, but I don't think many people would assume, if something like this happened, they'd be like, oh yeah, Sabi's the type of kid to do a murder. So for that part, at least, there's a strong connection between me and Adnan, and even more so than this, even more so than that, just the person he was. They also talk a little bit about his family setup, and also, the modern American Muslim, and I'll play that clip right now.
Adnan was born in the U.S., but his parents are from Pakistan, and they're conservative Muslims. No drinking, no smoking, no girls, all that. Saad and Rabia's parents are the same way. Their families are friends. But even though Adnan and Saad and their buddies were Muslims, they were also, shall we say, healthy American teenagers who were going to do what teenagers do, so long as they didn't get caught. So Adnan had to keep his relationship with Hayes secret.
So again, at the expense of sounding like a bad person, that is almost identical to my life situation, as I'm also from... my parents are from Pakistan, and I was born and raised in America, and the same values and same everything applies. And even that ending part of that video clip, which although might make me seem like a bad person, that is true. And I feel like if you asked majority of people in the same family type setup, they'd say the same thing, and that's just natural in this day and age for that type of stuff to happen. So if you overview both parts, both parts of Adnan Syed's life to mine, you can see there's a very strong correlation between the two, and it kind of creeped me out when I first heard it. But it also immediately pulled me into the podcast, and it was like, okay, well, now I'm like 100% there, because it almost felt like I was exactly in Adnan Syed's shoes, up until before the events occurred. So for that reason, especially the personal connection being so strong is one of the reasons why I don't think Adnan Syed is guilty, essentially. And because it's hard to, like, if someone described your exact situation and said, a person just like you is being charged with this murder, you'd find it kind of hard to be like, oh, well, I can see myself doing that, obviously. Almost to the point where I feel like, if I was available to be a juror for the case, they probably would not let me, almost, because of that strong connection with one of the parties being charged. So part one mainly just speaks to that. I think it's a very significant portion of why my opinion kind of leans the way it does about Adnan Syed, and I think it's a fair enough point to make, because it's hard, it's hard to charge someone that's almost identical like yourself and be like, yeah, I think this person's guilty. So at the end of part one, I definitely say that I'm leaning towards Adnan Syed being innocent. But that being said, this is a very personal, very personality, very just kind of like mental state of mind connection with Adnan Syed. And to, get the whole story, you have to look at more concrete, more hard evidence, and make your decisions not just based off how you feel, but more of the logical reasoning side of it. And that's why part two is gathered evidence. So there's a few key pieces of evidence I want to look at when talking what helped influence my decision in part two. And what's really neat was Serial.com, the podcast itself, provided a lot of the pieces of evidence on their own website. So I'll leave a link to that in this post as well. So if you guys want to go and check that out, you definitely should. But the first one that I want to point out is Asia's first letter to Adnan. Now, if you recall the podcast, you'll remember that Asia sent these letters to Adnan after he was charged with the murder, and basically she said, I can account for where you were during the time they say you murdered Hay. And I know, like, I remember that happening, and I remember it happening because 2 days later there was a whole ton of snow and we didn't have school, and I remember being mad at my boyfriend because he didn't pick me up in time. So there were some pretty significant timeline pieces given to us through those letters. But what spoke to me the most when I was reading these letters was how she described Adnan, and especially the fact that she even decided to help, because she states in the letters that we were not very close, and even in her affidavit later she states, so I was not really close with Hay or Adnan. But the fact that she remembers this conversation, but more importantly the fact that she talks about his innocence in these letters so clearly, saying, I know you're innocent, like, don't make me the wrong one here if I'm going on your behalf and saying this. It seems like a very true and honest statement, and if we can relate that back to the phone call that she has with Sarah 15 years later, she gives out this sort of not like painful sigh, like, I wish I had done more, I wish I could have done more to get him proven innocent, because it is her honest thought that he didn't do it. And even in letter one, she talks about how he spoke of Hay and how that was their main topic of conversation in the library. Their main topic of conversation was about Hay, and he said she said he talked about him in a very he talked about her in a very calm and collected manner and wished her nothing but the best, and that she remained very happy. And I think when you look at the character of Asia now, who seems a very honest, frontward person, and how she's describing Adnan, it's kind of hard to go against that. And unfortunately, like they said in the podcast, this affidavit wasn't really considered because Adnan said that he was in the school library, and she said he was in the library across from the school, which Adnan personally thought was considered the school library because it was so close. So that's the first pieces of evidence, both of those letters that Asia sent, that speak to me, because who would go that extra mile? Who would go so far to be, if you had even the suspicion of someone being guilty of a murder and you saw them in the library, even if that was the case, you wouldn't go and put yourself out there and be like, no, I know he didn't, I'm testifying on that, this is the honest truth. And she even states in one of her letters, she says, I didn't want to get involved with this at all, but I know that this is what happened and I just need this to, like, I wouldn't hold this information to myself. So that's the first important piece of evidence that kind of leaned me towards, again, thinking of Adnan's innocence. But secondly, there's the timeline that Jay gives, who's Adnan's best friend. And this is something that I find really weird about this whole case, is in this timeline piece that the Serial website provided, although it isn't an official document, they've timelined Jay's first, second, and third story, and there's so many differences between each, but they're all three very specific as well. You're asked to recall something from 6 weeks ago, you'd assume that you wouldn't remember every detail. Sure enough, yes, as I said in my previous podcast, if it was a very unique day, you would remember every detail. That's fair enough, but when your details are so far off from one another on your three, you're testifying 3 times, and all 3 times your timeline is so far off, but still you go into extra detail every single preceding timeline. That's what seems kind of sketchy to me, and that's why I don't know if Jay's story is reliable enough to pin this whole case on Adnan, because other than that, they did not have actual evidence of him being at the crime scene during the time they believe Hay was murdered. So the main piece of evidence that they're relying on to charge Adnan is, something that's very unreliable, very sketchy, and that's why looking at the hard evidence, again, it further reaffirms my suspicion that Adnan Syed is actually innocent. So once again, recapping, part 1, my personal connection with Adnan and my own personal belief and my own feeling that he couldn't have done such a crime because I wouldn't have. And now secondly, the evidence provided by Serial, which also points to some suspicion and some basic more supporting points for Adnan's innocence. But that brings us to part 3, because it is so sketchy and because it is such a wavering case. Another thing that influenced my decision on where I stand on this case is holes in the story. So while looking at some secondary sources to reaffirm my position on this case, I stumbled upon an article by Gawker.com, which is an alternative media source, a quite popular one now though. And they wrote an article on Serial, and it was actually very critical of Sarah Koenig and the way Serial is formed and how it's presented to the public. And reading an article like this, I jumped into it right away because I wanted to know where the holes were in this podcast, because it seemed to me personally that, there's so much evidence pointing towards him being innocent that the fact that he's charged guilty seems kind of weird. So I was like, well, Gawker wrote an article, and basically they called out Serial and Sarah Koenig, and they said there's some huge gaping holes in the story, and here's where they are. And I was very excited when I jumped into it, because I was like, I want someone to prove me wrong. I want someone to be like, you might think because of this and this that he's innocent, but actually he's guilty because of this and this. But when I started reading the article, that actually wasn't the case. And although it was critical of the podcast itself, yes, it did kind of provide helping points towards proving Adnan Syed innocent. And I've attached a link to that article as well down below. I suggest you pause it right now and give it a quick read through, because it is good to know. It's good to keep that in the back of your head going through this podcast. But the main reasons that the Gawker article spoke to was the mishandling of the trial, and this is something I spoke about, kind of hinted on in part 2. So what they talked about was the time this whole case was taking place and where it was taking place. So Baltimore of 1999, and during this time in this city, a lot of new prisons were being built, a lot of jails were being built, and moreover, a lot of trials and cases were going through some type of shady processing, where a lot of the youth, and what the article references, the African American youth in the city, were being put away for unfair reasons, or trials that weren't completely done 100% honestly. And they kind of call Sarah Koenig out on this, saying she focuses so much on the finite details of the day of the murder, and she doesn't once speak to why the judge didn't do this, or why the jury didn't do this, or this case went wrong here. And that's why it's really interesting to see that kind of outside perspective on the case, because it wasn't something I would have thought of if Gawker hadn't posted that article. But they did talk about why such a small thing such as Adnan saying he was in the library and not in the library across the street, why was that significant enough to cancel out Asia's affidavit, but Jay giving 3 shaky testaments, why wasn't that enough to discredit Jay's? And they talked about the way, like, the amount of just shadiness in the overall case that wasn't talked about, because it's something that's not entertaining. You want to know what murder weapon was used, or did they find the footsteps and the fingerprints, and that stuff keeps you going, and that stuff's entertaining. It has entertainment value. But speaking of the judiciary system of Baltimore in 1999, isn't. So they did call out Sarah mainly. That was the purpose of the article, calling her out for not speaking of these things. But while they did that, they also provided me with more reasons to believe Adnan Syed was innocent, and that, yes, 1, my personal connection did lead me to believe that as well. 2, the evidence kind of points to, Adnan not being that type of person either. But now 3, Gawker.com is, supporting my idea that the whole case itself was mishandled, and there was a existing bias during this time, and that's another reason why Adnan Syed was charged incorrectly. So now I'm sitting here. I was hoping someone would come and say, you're thinking this and this, but you weren't. But that wasn't the case, and Gawker kind of pushed me in the same direction I was going. They kind of pushed me down the hill. So now I'm going full speed. I'm like, you know what? I can't think of why, or just clearly why they, charged Adnan Syed, why they made him guilty. And I really want someone to, just give me that response of saying, you're missing this huge point, or you're missing this. So that brings me to part 4, which is I'm not alone in this. So once again, recapping. Part 1, my personal connection with Adnan, seeing where I would be if I was in his position. Part 2, looking at the hard evidence of the case, some files, some primary sources, some timelines, and seeing how that had an influence on my decision. Part 3, looking at a secondary source and seeing what they had to say about the podcast and the trial itself. And now part 4, which is not alone in this. Essentially what I decided to do for part 4 was send the link of the Serial Podcast episode 1 to a few people, and hope that they'd have enough time to listen to it, kind of analyze it a little bit, and get back to me. So the one person that was able to listen to it fully and then spare a few minutes to call in was one of my close friends, Grant, over in Toronto. So I decided to call him yesterday and get his opinion on the case. I hoped that by seeing where he stood, I would maybe get some, just another look that might open some doors that I'm not looking at right now, that, would have furthered my decision on whether he was innocent or guilty. So I'm going to play the audio clip from our phone call from yesterday. Take a look.
Hello?
Hey, Grant?
Hey, what's up? How are you?
I'm good, man. How are you?
I'm good.
All right,
What's up?
So just so you know, before we start talking, you are on speaker, and I also have this conversation mic'd up. I'm just doing this for my video podcast. So
Okay, yeah, no problem.
yeah, did you get a chance to listen to the podcast I sent last week?
Yeah, I did.
Okay.
I did.
Yeah, so I'm just gonna ask a couple, just the main question. Actually, I just want your thoughts and opinions on it. So
Okay, yeah.
yeah, so like I gave you my reasonings for why I thought Adnan was innocent, but I was just wondering, where do you stand after listening to the episode?
Yeah. Okay, well, first of all, I see where you're coming from,
Okay.
but I think there's a lot more to the case that you're not acknowledging. I think that Sarah isn't providing all the information,
Right.
that went into the case, or all the aspects of it. So she's sort of presenting it with this bias, which if you only hear that side, then obviously you're going to lean toward him being innocent.
Right.
And yes, the evidence is sketchy and has some holes in it, but I think you're discrediting the case entirely by saying that they missed enough points that would make him innocent.
Okay.
Like, I'm sure that they did a significant amount of research before sending him into prison. So I just think it's unfair for you to do that. Obviously, I'd have to hear more about the case from someone else, maybe with someone from the other side to get that view. But until then, I would say that he's still guilty.
Okay. Yeah, that's fair enough.
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of in between where I was standing and what most people think, but that's good to hear. Are you intrigued to listen to the next episode though? Like, do you like the podcast?
Yeah, no, for sure. That was a good job, dude.
All right, I appreciate that. Well, thank you, man. That's all I needed.
No problem.
All right, man. Take care. Take care, man. So my phone call with Grant didn't go exactly as I had thought, but he did bring up some great points, and I did kind of get that combating view that I was hoping for, even back in part 3. And he said, I do see where you're coming from, kind of, because the evidence is sketchy, there's holes and plots in it. But his main point was, I'm discrediting the judicial system itself and saying, that they didn't do enough research, whereas I'm sure, he was sure that they did enough thorough research on the case to, sentence a man, life in prison. It wouldn't have just been, like, oh, well, he said that they did it, so we're just going to agree and say that he did it. But a reassuring part of this was that, he did see that the evidence was kind of sketchy and kind of saw where I was coming from, which does, play in my favor. But I definitely do agree with him and see, that maybe I'm giving Sarah too much credit, because in the end of the day, she is an entertainer, and her job is to, entertain people, and while yes, journalism as well, she does also want to maintain audience focus, as time goes on. So I definitely see where his points were coming from, and I appreciate him calling in and giving me those opinions. So although I originally thought I wasn't alone in my perception of him being innocent, I kind of got a 50-50 response from my friends. So that also did play a role in me kind of backing out of saying, 100% this guy's innocent, all the points are pointing towards it, and kind of made me step back a little bit and say, okay, maybe not. Maybe I'm just too, at least hoping for him to be innocent too much. But that'll all be closed up and summed up and discussed in the final part, which is the conclusion. So, to sum up and conclude, Part 1, personal connection. Me and Adnan, a lot in common. If I put myself in his shoes, I can't really see, him being so pitiful or just so built up about his relationship with Hay to go and commit this crime. And it had me leaning way for him being innocent. Then I creeped onto the evidence given by Serial themselves in part 2, and I saw some more evidence that kind of supported my theory in that Adnan was a really good guy and he wouldn't be someone to do this crime, and Asia's letters kind of solidified that opinion. So I moved farther into the innocent side of the case. And then part 3, which was holes in the story, and again another article kind of supported the case that the whole system was messed up when this case went down, the top to bottom, judges to jury to jurors, everything wasn't done properly. And in the time where this case took place, there was some racial profiling and etc., and that also further pushed me to believe in his innocence. And finally, part 4, I'm not in this alone. I got a 50-50 response from my friend Grant, who, although yes, did say that I'm kind of discrediting the system, he did see some valid points in my arguments, which leave me where I am now. And that is my conclusion, that I still believe Adnan Syed is innocent, but definitely not fully, and definitely not with the full bias that the podcast portrays. Although Sarah Koenig does do a good job of keeping her serious tone and, keeping an unbiased kind of presentation of it. A lot of the stuff that she does say in her podcast and a lot of the stuff written on the website and the evidence it's providing kind of does push the bias towards Adnan being innocent, and in my belief primarily for entertainment value and that unknown value of the details of the murder. But regardless of the fact that that's true, I still think there's enough there to say maybe this case wasn't dealt with properly, and that Adnan Syed is in fact more innocent than guilty. So that's it for me, guys. Thanks for watching. I know this was significantly longer than my previous episode 1, but if you stuck around for all of it, I really appreciate it. I hope you guys can kind of relate to what I'm saying. If not, if you see some holes in my theory, then please let me know in the comments below. Or if you want to see another perspective or even another podcast that you want me to review, also leave that in the comments below and I'll try to get to all of them. But that's it for me, guys. Thank you for watching. This is Sabi Ali from Food for Thought. Peace.